Okay, so welcome to week 6 of MPAI 600 here at Georgetown University's Applied Intelligence Program. To start off with a couple of announcements. Paper 2 is due right now, whenever you're probably watching this, or depending on when you're watching this. So if you haven't gotten it done, please do so as soon as possible. The Zoom session, I think we had a very good Zoom session this past Thursday. For those of you who went, I think it was very productive, and I think even if you weren't part of the groups, you definitely got something out of it. In the next Zoom session, Group 4, 5, and 6 will be in the shoot 18 October. And what we'll do is it'll be a 2-hour Zoom session. So each group will have 20 minutes to brief, 10 minutes for questions, and then 30 minutes at the end to talk about jobs. So I know we've already had a couple of questions about internships and everything like that, so I just want to put that out. The one thing I do want to talk about jobs is I mentioned NGA, but a lot of the organizations for their graduate level internships are advertising now. In fact, they're closing now or in the next couple of weeks. It might not even last till the job talk. So apply if you want to break in as a graduate student, as a younger graduate student. Please apply now. And the reason they do that is the application comes in now, acceptance is in January, February. They start the clearance process so they can bring you on board over the summer to do some work, paid internship work for 10 weeks. And then your clearance continues as long as you don't do anything bad while you come back after the summer to graduate school to finish up. And then they hopefully, if you did your job right, have something lined up for you in June. There's been a decline, and I think we're coming back up as far as those internships. So please be on the lookout for them, and I'll send them when I see them as well. So current events, Supreme Court hearings. If you lived in Washington, that was probably the talk of the town for the last at least on Thursday. I'm not going to get into all the allegations brought up. What I will say is, as you progress in your careers testifying before Congress, some of you might have to do that. Others of you will prep others to testify before Congress. And I could say that, especially if you're in the civil service or even if you're in a political role, you don't want to talk to Congress the way that you saw the Supreme Court justice do. Now, he's going for the Supreme Court. He's on a very political role, so I guess he can talk that way. A couple of weeks ago, you had the FBI counterintelligence, Peter Strzok. He was talking that way to Congress. He's on his way out of a job, so I guess you can talk to Congress any way you want at that point. But for the most part, you have to be very respectful to not just Congress, but their aides and their staff members as well, because that is it's one of those things you don't want to be remembered. If you do it well, you're not going to get remembered, but if you do stick out for being negative, then your budgets and your corporate or your organizational structure can be affected. And again, this goes to talking to, you might be, I'm in my late 30s now, and I've had to talk to a 22-year-old congressional aide as if he was my boss or on an executive board that I was dealing with. So that, I just want to make sure that's clear if you ever progress in your career and you have to interact with Congress. So getting back to week 5, I know a lot of people are focused on the papers, and what I really want, if you missed the documentaries or missed the readings for this week, please go back and watch them. They're going to be part of the final, and they're just really good documentaries. So I can understand, again, if the paper, you were kind of backtracking because of the paper, but I want to just make sure that you get to the documentaries and you get to the readings as well. And some questions to come from all the readings. When does radicalization get monitored further? And this came up with the Fort Hood shooting. This has come up with the Boston Marathon, for the Orlando shooting. when do I get put on watch lists? And this is a key question, and there are criteria out there, but they're subjective. Is it when I have interacted with a known terrorist? When I've interacted with him over the internet? When I've passively watched his videos over the internet? When I've liked or subscribed to his YouTube videos? Does that get further scrutiny? And if you just want numbers to consider it, Anwar al-Awlaki, who inspired many of the attacks even after his death, he has about 150,000 subscribers to his various YouTube channels. You can't monitor every one of that. Every person that does that. ISIS has hundreds of thousands of Twitter, Facebook followers on their various websites as well, or their various social media. So when do you get put on a list when you deserve further scrutiny, for watch lists, for further surveillance? That's something, again, I just want you to think through as you've watched some of those documentaries. What do we do for people on the radar? And I call this minding the gap, for lack of a better term. And what the gap is, people are known to law enforcement or the intelligence community, but there's not enough to arrest them. So there's a little bit of a gap in between, and that's where the Boston Marathon bombers were. That was where the Beckland Theater attackers were. Those were where the Orlando shooter was. He was known. He was on the radar. So how do we solve this problem? And you saw in your in the EU documentary, those people were known to French and EU authorities who committed the Beckland Theater attack, but it's not like Crockett and Tubbs. For those of you who don't know who Crockett and Tubbs were, go Google Miami Vice and you can watch all of it or hear all about that. But it's not like Crockett and Tubbs where one guy can follow a terrorist for 24 hours a day. That's not how it works. So how can we, what I call close the gap, or make sure those people are not in the, or that are in the gap, are not dangerous? Watch listing is one of them that we do. We put people on no-fly lists. Sometimes we put them on watch lists so they can't get jobs in certain sensitive areas. Another, again, that's been brought up is gun control, and I'm not going to get into the gun control debate here, but if you're on a list or you're on the radar screen, we can limit your access to guns. So how do we deal with this problem for, again, people on the radar? Do we have the appropriate funding structures and people? I would argue we have the appropriate funding. Whether we're using the funding correctly is another issue. But when I say structures, are the right people talking to each other? And I brought this up last week in the NSA documentary, and some of you who did your papers on 9/11, there was no structure before 9/11 for an intercept collected at the federal level to be disseminated down to local law enforcement in San Diego that could actually action that intercept or open an investigation or do something that would have mitigated that. That means the structures were inappropriate. I still argue that our structures are still inappropriate. I still argue that there is a disconnect between information collected at the federal level and getting it disseminated down to municipal, local law enforcement and what I call our action arms. In my fantasy world, for lack of a better term, a police officer on the street would know and be able to walk down a street and say, hey, the guy who lives in that neighborhood or in that house there, he's traveled to Yemen 6 times. Now, we know that at the federal level because we have customs and visa regulations and those types of issues. But that's not disseminated down to the police officer. You know that. Or the police officer walks down the street and say, hey, that guy in there has been communicated with a known suspect terrorist 20 times over the last year. That would be the ideal structure that could mitigate some of the terrorism issues. So when you're going through your jobs, just try and figure out, okay, are the right people communicating information down? And then I just want to wrap this up. Should we just accept this? Should we accept that lone wolves, low-level attacks, when I say low-level, yeah, I mean 50 people died in Orlando. I think 6 people died in New York with the rollover or the vehicle strikes that occurred in Halloween this year. Is that just, no one wants to say par for the course, and no one wants to say this out loud, but in a free society, in a democratic society, should we just accept that we're going to have a little bit of risk? We've largely accepted that in the United States, that these shooters that kill, 13 people in San Bernardino and 50 people in Las Vegas, or 60 people in Las Vegas and 50 or so people in Orlando, we've accepted that as a society. There aren't really a lot of changes that have occurred. In fact, there's no changes that have occurred. And we just say, hey, that's, it's sad to be in that 0.00001% that's killed, but for 99.999% of people, you're not affected by that. And I think we've accepted that. Should we just accept that lone wolf attacks like the Boston Marathon attack and the New York attack are just par for the course in a democratic society? I'll let you decide, and I'd be open to all sorts of arguments on that front. So, preview of week 6. We're going to the criminal intelligence section. So you shift from terrorism to criminal intelligence. The Lemieux article, the Lemieux lecture. He's our program director. In case you don't know that, and his expertise is in criminal intelligence and criminology. So you're gonna hear his lecture. You're not going to see me this week, and he's going to talk about a couple of things. CompStat, which some analysts believe led to the huge decrease in crime that we've seen from the 1960s down to the present time. And CompStat, it's not a computer program, but it's just a system of accountability for law enforcement, for precinct captains and others, that many believe led to, or was a good contributing factor to the decrease in crime. And that's the question they're going to ask: is what led to the decline in crime? Was it better policing, intelligence-driven policing? Was it better law enforcement, or was it things outside of law enforcement? Demographics, the aging of the baby boomers, according to the book Freakonomics, and this is controversial, they say abortion became legalized, and that led to the decline in crime. And I'm not going to even get into whether that's right or wrong, or the abortion issue, but their theory is the decline in crime. Was it economics, better economic conditions? Consider that as you're going through this week's reading. And then we're going to talk about law enforcement technologies, and we're going to use the Boston Marathon attack as a case study, and you're going to get a documentary on that. And it's not to look at intelligence surrounding the Boston Marathon. That's what we looked at this past week. But we're going to look at intelligence or investigative technologies, facial recognition, bomb analysis, and we're going to ask how applicable are those to other law enforcement community or other law enforcement scenarios. So if there's any questions or issues, please let me know, and I look forward to reading your papers this week.